Hey everybody, welcome back for week 13 of our Effects on Violin series. This week we are talking about dynamic EQ. Those of you who have been around for the full 13 weeks, you know what's going on. Each week we're going to talk about a different effect. These are a few effects that we have talked about in the past, along with the guest artists that we have brought in to talk about how they like to use that effect as an artistic tool in their work. This week we are talking about dynamic EQ, and you're thinking, Matt, I feel like we already kind of talked about EQ for 2 whole weeks. This is a different thing. This is a marriage of EQ and compression. Sometimes people will refer to it as multiband compression. Technically, those are 2 different things. They're kind of siblings, and we will talk about what the little subtle differences are between those 2 in a few minutes. But just as a refresher on EQ, that is raising or lowering the amplitude of a range of frequencies in your signal. What the heck does that mean? Across the whole range of your frequency spectrum that your instrument can create, instead of turning the whole thing up or down, we may want to turn certain frequencies up or down in order to change the coloration of our tone. Maybe make it warmer, less harsh, maybe brighter, more distinct. Those are all things that we can do with EQ. With compression, that is the lowering the volume of a signal that exceeds a threshold by a given amount. And again, what does that mean? We can say that we set this volume threshold, and below that threshold, the compressor does nothing. And above that threshold, it shrinks our dynamic range. It makes our louds a little quieter and effectively makes our quiets a little bit louder. And it means that it can sort of shrink the distance between our loudest louds and our quietest quiets. If you're still not sure what compression does or EQ does, I urge you to go back and watch the longer videos that we did on those. But we're going to kind of move forward here. What happens with EQ, it's a static overlay that's applied all the time, no matter what. So if we pull down some 400 hertz, 400 hertz is pulled out of your signal all the time, no matter what. And compression is a thing that is applied across the entire frequency spectrum. It's going to compress low frequencies just like it compresses high frequencies. But what if that's not what you want? What if you only want EQ applied in certain situations? Maybe when I'm playing quietly, I like the way my violin sounds, but when I play louder, I'm like, I feel like I could use more EQ here. I could really use more of an adjustment to my tonality here. Or with compression, maybe there's only certain frequencies that I want compressed. I want to shrink the dynamic range of those frequencies only. Right? So the 2 to 5 kilohertz range can be kind of painful. It's a problematic frequency for electric strings. It's where we find that piezo quack that a lot of people don't like. Anytime you hear a mix and it feels like somebody's just ice picking you in the eardrum, that's sort of usually in that 4 to 5K range. That's where like physical pain comes in. But it's also where intelligibility is. So you're saying, man, I want to scoop out that 2 to 5K range so that it's not hurting people when I'm playing. But if you go too far, you lose intelligibility and it starts to sound kind of muffled. So at low volumes, I may want to leave that frequency range intact, but at high volumes, I want to pull it down. That's where dynamic EQ would come in. And you can see here, we've selected that frequency range kind of between 2 and 5 kilohertz. And as we play louder and louder, it's going to dip that frequency for me in a dynamic way, not a static way. Now, I've got a demo video coming up for you where I'm going to play some distorted violin, because that's where we really find those 2 to 5K frequencies really start kind of being more problematic with distortion. I'm going to play with no EQ at all. I'm going to play with static EQ, pulling out that problematic range. And then I'll play with a dynamic EQ, only pulling that range out when it reaches a certain threshold. So you'll be able to hear in the lower frequencies, it still has all that intelligibility, but in the higher volume ranges, or as I start moving up the neck on the instrument, it's going to pull those problematic frequencies down. So on the one with flat EQ, the lower notes, you're like, yeah, that's got a little brightness in there, but it sounds good. As I come up the neck and start hitting some of those harmonics, you're like, ooh, that's a little spiky. When we put on a static EQ, the lower notes now sound kind of dull, but the higher notes, at least they don't hurt, right? So then when you put in dynamic EQ, those lower notes still have the sparkle they used to have, but the higher notes have had those, kind of painful, spiky frequencies. Those have been pulled down. So you kind of end up getting the best of both worlds there, and that's why dynamic EQ can be a game changer for you. Now, we said that there is a subtle difference between dynamic EQ and multiband compression. Compression tends to be less transparent, right? So a compressor is going to color your tone even if it's not compressing. Even if I've got my thresholds and ratios set to where it's not actually squeezing the dynamic range any, the circuit that it's passing through is designed to color the tone. So if I use a multi-band compressor, it's going to change my tone even if I'm not squeezing anything. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. That's really up to you. EQ tends to be a little more transparent. So a technically dynamic EQ will not affect your tone at all, except in the frequency ranges where it is doing the dipping, right? So again, very, very subtle difference here. And which one's better? Well, there isn't a better, they're just a little bit different. Okay, you've convinced me, Matt. I want to use dynamic EQ or multiband compression. How do I do that? In the studio, there are multiple plugins for both of those things. Live, a lot of front of house boards have multiband compression or dynamic EQ. So you could talk to your front of house engineer and say, hey, I really want to do some multiband compression in that 2 to 5K range. Let's mess around with this a little bit, find the threshold and the ratio, and you can do that for me at front of house. The Helix, if you're using the Helix family of products, there is a multi-band compressor in the Helix. It's called the 3-band compressor, I think. And there are a number of stomp boxes who claim to do it. If you Google multi-band compressor stomp box, a ton of stuff is going to come up, or dynamic EQ stomp box. A lot of stuff is going to come up. Some of them actually do that. Some of them don't. They'll just use the name multi-band compressor in there, or they'll say, oh, it's got a dynamic sound to this EQ pedal. It's not actually a dynamic EQ. You kind of have to dig into the description and look at the knobs on the thing and go, hey, do I actually have the ability to select a frequency range that I'm affecting? And so make sure, let the buyer beware a little bit on that. Make sure that if you buy a multi-band compressor or a dynamic EQ pedal, that it actually is what it says it is. Where do I put this in my signal chain? I generally put this sort of closer to the end of my signal chain after I've done all the things I'm going to do. I'll use some static EQ early in my signal chain. Then I'll do my distortion or whatever else I'm going to do. Then I will put a dynamic EQ. Then I will do my time-based effects, delay and reverb. Again, you're going to have to kind of experiment with this to make sure that it sounds the way you want it to sound. And of course, like any other effect, you've got to check this with your ears. You're going to want to A/B this with no EQ, with static EQ, and with dynamic EQ. It sounds really cool, right? Hey, this is fancy. It's doing all these other things. Make sure that you actually like the way it sounds. Nobody cares how you're getting the sound you get. They're not going to say, oh, well, if you're using dynamic EQ, then I guess it's fine. They only know what it sounds like. So if it sounds better to your audience, then that's kind of the end goal. It's not about how sexy the process is in getting there, right? All right, so let's show a little bit more of an example of how this dynamic EQ or multiband compression works, okay? So you can see that it's working as we get up to those high notes, and it's really, really screaming on you. That's when you're going to hear it kicking in. You'll also see it on the wah pedal. When the toe goes down and they get bright, it's going to pull those bitey frequencies out more. All right, so hopefully that has been helpful for you. Hopefully now you understand dynamic EQ or multiband compression better than you did. And as always, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Check out these other videos that we've done, and we will see you guys next time.